It may not seem obvious nowadays, but back in the late 90s, wrestling games were all the rage. Anytime you went over to a friend's house, they almost always had a PlayStation 1 or N64 that had a wrestling game slotted inside of it. Games like WCW vs. NWO World Tour and WWF No Mercy are considered among many to not only be some of the best wrestling games of all time, but some of the best video games of all time. These games had buttery smooth controls, tons of playable characters to choose from, and gorgeous animations that really made you feel every slam and punch you dished out onto your opponent. But who is responsible for making some of these all-time classics? Those people would be the lovely folks over at AKI Corporation. AKI are commonly credited as some of the best video game developers of all time, and constantly set the bar on how good a wrestling game should be. While many who owned a PS1 were doing just fine with games such as WWF Warzone and WCW Backstage Assault, anyone who owned an N64 were absolutely foaming at the mouth at just the thought of booting up WWF No Mercy one more time before heading to bed. After working on many games, they were hired on by EA Sports to make a sequel to the critically panned WCW Mayhem, which is often credited as one of the worst wrestling games of all time. However, midway through the game's development, WCW was bought out by their rival company, WWF, and the game was soon cancelled. Here's the problem, however. AKI still had to make a game. They signed a contract with EA, and they had to have a game out on store shelves by a set date. But how do you do that when you have no fighters, no arenas, and no logos to go off of? Why, it's simple. You just go over to Def Jam Records, ask for their rappers' likenesses, sign on talents such as DMX, Method Man, and the future voice actor of Kratos from God of War, instead.
What did he say?
And thus, Def Jam Vendetta was born. What? You think I'm joking? That's actually what happened. Google it yourself. So, now that we've explained the simple history,
What a load of bullshit.
behind this game, let's discuss the actual game. Def Jam Vendetta is a wrestling game developed by EA Sports Big and the already mentioned AKI Corporation. The game was met with positive reviews upon release, with many citing it as the most unexpectedly good game of the generation. Why is that, you may ask? It's mainly down to the fact that the idea of a wrestling game where I can make Redman punt a Guile wannabe so hard in the balls that he dies on the spot sounds ridiculous to most people. On paper, it just seems plain absurd. But in execution, Def Jam Vendetta pulls off the idea so well, it seems almost superhuman. Upon starting the game up, you're greeted by an intro giving the synopsis of the game. In this intro, we meet D-Mob, the leader of an underground fight ring known as Def Jam. He boldly states that nobody can beat him. So obviously by the end of the game, we're going to stunner him into oblivion. The game then brings us to the main menu, where we're given the option to watch some tutorial videos that explain the gameplay, wrestle in some standard matches, which includes one-on-one matches, 4-person free-for-alls, and tag team matches, or we can hop straight into story mode. The first thing I did was actually hop into the tutorial videos, mainly because I've never played an AKI game before. The videos actually give you a pretty good idea of what to do, which is a good thing because Jesus Lord, the CPU is aggressive in this game. By default, the CPU is set to medium difficulty, and despite what you may think, at this difficulty, they don't take any prisoners. They won't hesitate to slam your ass into a separate continent and will KO you in a moment's notice. Luckily, by the time I beat story mode for the first time, I had a pretty fair grasp on the gameplay, so this difficulty curve did not last long. As for the gameplay, it is, for the most part, smooth as butter. Attacks feel raw and chunky, which makes every hit all the more satisfying. Kicks and punches feel satisfying to pull off, while slams look as though they turned the person on the receiving end into a cripple. The controls for the game are actually very simple, which puts this game into the category of easy to learn, hard to master. You can play this game casually, but if you want to, you can take the CPU to school and back. In this game, you have standard strikes that come in light, heavy, and special varieties, all of which depend on how far away you are from your opponent. The same goes for grapples, which also allow you to turn your opponent around mid-grapple to hit a back grapple on them. While you're fighting, you'll also want to keep an eye on your health and momentum meters at the bottom of the screen. Your health is indicated by the bottom meter, and if it gets too low, the next move your opponent hits could put you down for good. If your momentum meter fills up, you can perform a special move known as a blazing move, which we'll get into later. As for the game's presentation, it's absolutely stunning. For mid-PlayStation 2, the graphics look incredible. The lighting in the arenas is dynamic, all the characters look like who they're supposed to be, and the variety of arenas you have is actually pretty mesmerizing. You have underpasses, churches, dance clubs, rooftops, and even scrapyards, all of which come with a wrestling ring included. Don't ask me how they managed to fit a wrestling ring on a rooftop, I'm not an expert in that kind of thing. Since this game is a wrestling game, you have your standard methods of victory, such as pinfalls and submissions. However, you can also just straight up knock out your opponent, and in order to do this, you must hit a blazing move on your opponent when their health's low enough. The main selling point of this game are the blazing moves, which are your fighter's finishing moves. To sum it up in a single sentence, blazing moves are fucking ridiculous. You have stone cold stunners, multiple power bombs, assaulting your opponent's testicles so violently that having kids is now a thought of the past, and whatever the fuck this move is supposed to be. All of them are very well animated and fit the characters nicely. Not just that, but each character has two of them, so you have more than one way to slam the calcium out of your opponent's bones. Speaking of the characters, you have several members of the Def Jam record label to play as. But strangely enough, they aren't the only playable characters in the game. You have members of Def Jam, such as Method Man, Redman, DMX, and Joe Budden, but you also have original characters such as Sketch, who looks exactly as he sounds, Chuckles, who has the same story going for him as Sketch, and the main man himself, D-Mob. I'm going to be completely honest here, outside of Joe Budden, DMX, Method Man, and Ludacris, I've never heard of any of these guys, so I can't give my thoughts on any of them. The characters all have their own moves and movesets, which allows them to stand out more. You have grapplers like D-Mob, Spider, and Method Man, strikers like Proof and Redman, and more zany characters like Joe Budden, Manny, Sketch, and Chuckles, who all fall somewhere in the middle. All the characters are fun to play as, so it's highly recommended that you try to experiment with all of them and see who you like. My personal favorite's DMX, mainly due to the fact that he has one of the most overly ridiculous blazing moves in the game. Moving away from the characters, we have the story of Def Jam Vendetta, which is really simple to be honest. We play as one of 4 playable characters, that being Proof, Briggs, Spider, or Tank, and try to rise up through the fighting circuit so we can eventually take down that guy from the intro, known as D-Mob. But why are we taking down D-Mob? Turns out, he beat the living crap out of us a few years ago and stole our girlfriend known as Angel in the process, kicking us out of the fighting scene and making us look like a complete joke. Also, one of our best friends, known as Manny, owes D-Mob a lot of money, and we need to bail him out fast. The only way we can go up against D-Mob, however, is if we win the Def Jam tournament, a tournament we can only participate in by beating the shit out of DMX in a scrapyard, as you usually do. After we get to the finals, D-Mob attempts to kill us out of frustration, which probably isn't helped by the fact that at the last second, Angel just dumps D-Mob and joins back up with us. At the last possible moment, Manny takes the bullet, literally, and we tackle D-Mob over the guardrail, where we proceed to, as I stated earlier, stone cold stunner his ass into oblivion. We then walk off into the sunset with our girlfriend in hand as the credits roll and D-Mob is arrested. It's, in fairness, a very simple story, but it's compelling enough that by the time I got to the end and I saw the credits, I was actually pretty satisfied. Now, I've praised this game a lot, heralding the graphics, the presentation, and the controls, but I do have a few minor gripes with Def Jam Vendetta, with the main one being that a few of the fights in the story mode are a little bit annoying. The difficulty, for the most part, is very well balanced, but there's one fight in particular that really gets on my tits every time I play through the story mode. That being the mandatory fight against Snowman, Pocket, and House. Right before you reach the end of the Def Jam tournament, D-Mob sends all 3 of these goons to ensure you don't make it to the finals. Not just that, but you have to fight them in a handicap match, which means it's just one of you versus 3 of them. This makes the fight almost impossible on some difficulty levels, because as you're trying to fight off one of them, the other 2 are most likely trying to grapple your ass, which means that you'll end up in situations where you just cannot fight back. Not just that, but due to how the momentum system works, you can try and take out one of them to get momentum to hit a blazing move, but if another one decides to start grappling you, you'll lose that momentum, meaning you'll never get close to hitting a blazing move. The only thing that makes this fight actually bearable is the fact that the only way to win the fight is to only knock out one of them. If you had to knock out all three of them to progress, this fight would literally be the bane of my existence. This isn't helped by the fact, however, that the only way to secure a KO in Def Jam Vendetta is to make sure your opponent's health is low enough and then hit a blazing move. Hitting a blazing move on its own is not enough to instantly KO an opponent. So you might get very close to knocking out your opponent, but if their health recovers at the last second, all that effort meant nothing. Another problem with the game is that it doesn't really have a lot of match types. As I've already mentioned, the game has its standard one-on-one, tag team, free-for-all, and handicap matches, but it has absolutely nothing outside of that. No ladder matches, table matches, or anything like that. There is, in fairness, a survival mode where you fight through the entire game roster with a slightly regenerative health bar, but outside of that, there's really nothing to do in Def Jam Vendetta. All there really is to do is play through the story mode and then play a few casual matches with all of your freshly unlocked characters. In fact, speaking of the story mode, another problem I have with it is that despite having 4 playable characters, the story does not change depending on who you play as. The story with Briggs is the exact same as the story with Spider. The only thing that changes is, well, the character you're playing as. Hell, the only reason you'd want to go back and play through the story mode with other characters is to unlock a few hidden characters you can only get for beating the story mode with all 4 of the characters, and unlocking each of the characters' exclusive hidden attires. But if that's the only reason that you want to play through the story mode, and if that's the only reason the story mode gives you to come back and play it again, then it's not doing enough to intrigue me. At the end of the day, despite all the little issues I have with Def Jam Vendetta, it's honestly a fun time. It's got fun archaic gameplay which will remind you of the classic AKI games of old, and honestly does enough with its unique concept to keep players intrigued. If you told me that a game where a bunch of rappers and hip-hop artists beat the crap out of each other in a wrestling ring was fun, I would laugh at you. However, the concept alone would be enough to intrigue me, and as I've already stated, the actual execution of the concept is very well done. Def Jam Vendetta would easily sell over 1 million copies, and would be heralded as one of the best games on the PlayStation 2. But oddly enough, despite the fact that this concept seems to have nowhere else to go, that wasn't the last we'd actually hear about Def Jam as a video game series. Join me next time for when we take a look at the sequel to Def Jam Vendetta, where the fight is taken to the streets of New York.